Brandon Thurston from Wrestlenomics is up next, and we're going to follow Brandon with John Pollock from Post Wrestling.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone.
But we can't ignore the math, okay? We can't ignore the data.
Go on Google Trends, type in your name, then type in mine. You're a straight line. I'm a pyramid.
I like the very direct question on that.
Television ratings, downward spiral. Buy rates plummeting.
The time is now to turn the math around.
Welcome to this week's edition of Pollock and Thurston. He is Brandon. I am John.
Hello.
I think we're both exhausted by this time as January comes to an end, and here we are. Welcome back from your trip to Tampa, Brandon.
I'm fine. I was tired earlier in the week, but I think I have recovered or at least passed by the opportunity to be tired.
Well, that's good that you have powered through. I mean, you were the Iron Man on Saturday night by not just sitting through the 4-hour Royal Rumble event, the press conference, of course, that followed, but then the man gets all the way back to his hotel room, does a guest spot with myself and Wei Ting. How many hours of sleep did you get on Saturday night / into Sunday morning? Was it over or under 3?
So I've done a few of these press conferences now, and I can never sleep right after them. There's too much happening. I did the Brawl Out press conference. I mean, we didn't even know everything that we would know right away in that one. But I went to sleep probably around 3 a.m. and then woke up around 7 to get an Uber to the airport. So 4 hours.
Did you go back and watch any of the press conference, or did you all you absorbed it in real time? Didn't need to.
I did watch it one more time. I've only watched it once. Yeah. I watched the Pollock portion again. Yeah.
Days removed. I mean, there was obviously, I think, granted a lot of criticism towards Paul Levesque in that specific setting. Is that sort of where you stand right now? Do you look back at it as sort of how it was handled, and if they went in adequately prepared for what was going to be a dominant topic?
Obviously, they weren't adequately prepared, or at least Paul was not. Ultimately, I would think there's a lot of his own judgment in terms of, am I prepared enough? Or I can't say for sure that there weren't PR people who were trying to prepare him better, or that, who knows? I feel like, wow, I got a lot of nice messages afterward for asking a simple question that I don't think was that hard to ask. And I appreciate everyone's nice comments. There were, I believe, 7 questions asked Paul Levesque. Only 3 of them were about this story. The others were about things that were less important. And I feel it's become clear to me that, yes, there's all different people asking all different things. I don't need anybody to be on the same page as me when it comes to talking about attendance or TV ratings. But I think we do need to be on the same page when it comes to sexual assault and sexual harassment in the workplace. And I just can't see any excuse for not asking about that. With the other 4 questions could have been about that as well.
Yeah, I can't buy for a second that Paul Levesque went into that press conference not thinking that would come up. And I think that was some people's reaction was he really going into this with the expectation that this might not come up? Like this, let's not forget that not all that many months ago, we saw the report, I think it was from Fightful, about they were prepared to get CM Punk questions at a press conference. Like they went in with that expectation and a game plan. So I mean, that is, beyond trivial. And here we are. Like, to me, this is front, back, and center of everything that they should have gone in there with the expectation of in front of the press. I just and maybe Paul was just in the moment, just not comfortable asking or answering the question.
This is his father-in-law. This is personal for him as well as professional.
I get that. And that's an understandable conflict. But at the same time, you are holding this position where you are the front-facing representative of this company in an executive capacity. And if you cannot fulfill that duty because of the familial ties, then maybe somebody else should be there in that seat facing the press that has gone through the lawsuit and is prepared to have something of a response. It is not as though this broke hours before the Royal Rumble on this crazy production day. You had multiple days. This was one of the biggest mainstream news stories of those from Thursday until Saturday night. So while I can understand that he is tied to Vince McMahon in a way that few are, that is the conflict that you have to be able to balance, not just on Saturday, but moving forward in this entire case too.
Yeah, and I sort of mentioned this when I was talking to you guys on Saturday night, but I think it's, I can understand people being skeptical about what these press conferences really are, and I was too before I attended one, in terms of thinking that, does WWE manipulate these situations so that the questions being asked are exactly the questions that they want asked? In 3 out of 7 of the questions, clearly that was not a question that they would have preferred to be asked, I would think, because I mean, Pollock was not interested in talking about it, obviously. But I've been to 3 of these now, and I've never had a problem getting access to them. I've requested 3 times. I've been accepted 3 times. I've been at 3 press conferences. At each one, I asked a question about Vince McMahon that they would probably would prefer I did not ask. So this is not a case of WWE's PR team manipulating the situation so that only questions that they want to get asked get asked. It's not that. It's on the media to ask these questions, and they haven't cut me off yet. And I'm going to try to get access to the WrestleMania conference, so I intend to be there too.
Do you expect there to be one in Australia next month?
I would think so. I mean, they've done them in Puerto Rico, which is not that far from continental U.S., obviously, but they did one for Money in the Bank, which is a big market for them. But I would think there's going to be enough media in Australia to make this happen. It's a stadium show, right?
Yeah. Optus Stadium is, 40,000 plus as well. So do you realize that show is going head to head with Okada's final match in New Japan with a 5 a.m. start time for WWE? So they will be the same time as that Sapporo card from New Japan.
So Elimination Chamber is starting at 5 a.m. Eastern time?
Yeah, they're airing it live.
And no way Okada could do both shows.
No, that is out
not
of
that far from Australia, Japan.
Maybe if we inquired with Hulk Hogan and his ability to manipulate the date line, maybe he could be in 2 places at once.
He has a time machine, I think. Yeah.
All right. Okada might come up a little later on, but we do want to focus on this story. And I want to go back some of the coverage of the past couple of days on the Vince McMahon lawsuit. And as well, I want to revisit some comments that Nick Khan gave a year ago when he was on the Bill Simmons show and addressing Vince McMahon's initial retirement/resignation in the summer of 2022 and how this was couched just days after his return to the board of directors and his previous role. But first of all, let's check in with Matt Bellany and Lucas Shaw on the Town podcast, discussing the Netflix deal with WWE and this cloud over the company's head after the allegations dropped in the lawsuit from Janelle Grant.
Do you see the Vince McMahon awfulness as being any issue for this deal? I mean, it's the timing of it. If the lawsuit against McMahon and him stepping down and all of that, the allegations against him had come out even a week ago, I think it would have been a problem for this Netflix deal. But from my understanding, Netflix has communicated to WWE that, Vince is out now. They're going full steam ahead on this.
Well, I think that the deal is one of the reasons you saw TKO move so swiftly to push him off the board or have him step down from the board. Because you remember, it was honestly insane that he was back at the company. This is someone who was...
Vince McMahon has a record now. He's the first person to be canceled twice.
Yeah. He resigned or took a leave of absence or whatever the hell it was a couple of years ago after all the reporting about the hush money he'd paid to people to settle some allegations or settle some cases. He was able to come back because he ultimately controlled the company and because they wanted to sell it and nobody was going to say no. But this feels like the final straw. And if he stays away, it's, you're not going to get too mad at Netflix for doing a deal with a valuable property so long as the guy's no longer involved.
All right, we had to keep the whoosh in there to transition back. But yes, that was Matt Bellany and Lucas Shaw. And what you take from that is sort of what we have seen as probably the strategy from a TKO standpoint, in that we have eliminated the problem in Vince McMahon and to its partners, the idea that it is self-contained to this problem in Vince McMahon. That was enough for Slim Jim to jump back on board after a 24-hour pause. And in the case of Netflix, it seems like that is the same positioning that they are taking, that this has been a suitable enough action, even though you can look at this being potentially just the beginning of a much deeper look into the company and who else is named in this lawsuit or unnamed in this lawsuit. You might be muted, Brandon.
This lawsuit, which is suing Vince McMahon and John Laurinaitis, and that's it, right? That they're not suing the company here.
The company are defendants in this case.
Okay,
yes.
and it's an interesting point. We'll have to ask Michael McCann when he comes on later. I'm really curious to know whether or not they're all going to be defended by the same set of lawyers. But I think this is it's on its surface, which the vast majority of the public isn't going to look past the surface. If you're just getting rid of the key person here, and Laurinaitis has been gone for a year or two now, but if you're just getting rid of Vince, maybe that feels like that's enough. But clearly, Janelle Grant is accusing at least 4 executives with WWE of having knowledge and not doing anything about it. So this points to a larger issue with the culture, according to her.
That's a big part of this case, is the fact that it is being done with the hopes that others come forward too. And as Brandon mentioned, we're going to be joined by Michael McCann, who is a lawyer and a sports legal expert at Sportico. And we're going to be talking about more of the legal questions and implications of this case as well as we go into that direction. But yeah, I think that this is ultimately going to be the temperature that the company feels satisfied with in terms of what pushback do they receive publicly, privately, at least from the stock point of view, Brandon. Like when we last spoke, we were looking at this as of last week, that the stock was largely unmoved as a result of this. On Monday, there was a bit of a drop for the stock, but where do we stand now on Wednesday afternoon, about an hour before the market closes today, in relation to where the stock has moved?
So the stock is at $84, which is down for the day by about 1%, but the indexes are down by roughly the same. There was a day, so if we look at for people watching in video, if we look at the 1 month view, there was a day a couple days ago where it did fall pretty hard. I believe on Monday, it was down by 4%, but the very next day it was up by 3% and recovered most of the value that it lost. So this big spike up here, which is January 23rd, where it closed at $89.63. That's the day that the Netflix deal was announced and that Dwayne Johnson is on the TKO board. It got as high as $89.63 that day. And it's been sort of going back down ever since, which is kind of what usually happens when you have some big news and the stock price really reacts positively, sort of come back down to earth in the following days. But point being, this stock is not really changed that much in value. It's about where you would expect it to be if this news never broke.
So the next people we're going to hear from are Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez on the Monday night edition of Wrestling Observer Radio. And this is from Meltzer's reporting of people he has spoken to in terms of the implication of, did others know beyond this, and as well the details of the lawsuit. So here is that.
They need to investigate, and they need to, not the one that they did the last time, and they need to find out, again, it's like, who knew? Lots of people knew. We know that. But as far as, what happened, or what has been happening, or the culture there, that's something that really needs to be coming out. Because obviously there's a lot more. It's been around for a long, long time. Yes, it stops and ends with Vince McMahon. He was the guy at the top. But, as somebody said to me tonight, the whole place from the walls and everything was, pretty much crawling with, bad things, and they need to blast that place up, and they kind of do.
Well, when you say that everybody knew, the question
everybody knew certain things.
Yeah, what did everyone know? Because I don't think most people, I don't think virtually anybody knew the extent of what ended up in that 67-page lawsuit. I think a lot of people suspected that Vince had girlfriends and, Laurinaitis. I think, there have been stories about stuff like that forever, but not to this degree. There was nobody, there was not one person that I talked to, and I talked to a lot of people that read the lawsuit and went, "Oh, you didn't know about that?" Nobody said that. Everybody was like, "Oh my God!"
I had one person who didn't even work for the company, but was best friends with someone who was with the company for decades. And I said, man, it was really I learned, there's a whole lot there that I'd never heard before, and just goes, why are you so naive? He goes like, I was friends with X. I knew all of it.
Wow.
So that certainly paints a picture of that. I mean, the degree of which, we can only really speculate on, of like how much this kind of permeated its way through the company. I think the idea of this being an open secret that Janelle Grant had laid out in the lawsuit in relation to this relationship with Vince McMahon, I think that has pretty clearly been identified. And then when we go into the details, if you take a statement like that here is someone not even with the company that is not surprised by any of the contents of the lawsuit, that does give you a pretty grim picture in terms of just how much was known.
Yeah, I do remember asking somebody maybe around the time that the original scandal broke in 2022, sort of what the culture was like, and being told that the culture, whatever problems are happening there was not their experience. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't, that there wasn't, that culture wasn't really bad in certain areas of the company. But at least, that wasn't everybody's experience, was the impression that I got.
Yeah, now that we have had several days, almost a week since this lawsuit came out, it's been hard not to notice what the reaction has been like within the industry, within those that have either worked for Vince McMahon in the past or work currently. Now, I'm not suggesting that talent that are currently in the company are going to be speaking out on this voluntarily, but I do think it does lend itself to the nature of protecting the business that you are going to see of people that do have history with Vince McMahon or are just within the fraternity of professional wrestling. And instead of this being something of, calling attention to problems, to facilitate change, to improve the internal culture, it is more so a back against the wall sort of response. And there have been some that have spoken up, that have been just repulsed by what this is, but it's not as though people are raising their hand to step up and comment on this in any meaningful way beyond a handful.
No, I will say it is different in terms of we're not getting people saying, wow, no matter what you think about Vince McMahon, you got to appreciate what he did from a business perspective. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen people saying, thank you, Vince, for all your years of service, and we appreciate you in your retirement.
Just put legendary in front of his name.
Yeah.
None of those. You're right. That's a great point, is that while you're not getting condemnation of Vince, you're also not getting the, hey, but he was good to me type of support either. Like no one is stepping out to support this individual either.
Yeah, because in 2022 we had a number of NDAs that were reported and essentially confirmed by the company. We knew that there were, I believe, 7 women who accused him of various kinds of sexual misconduct over the years. What we didn't have was, other than Rita Chatterton at the time, we didn't have a face and a name accusing him in detail of what Janelle Grant accuses him of in that 67-page complaint.
And no one that can cling to the consensual description that it was so thrust by defenders.
We had comments, including from Jericho on a podcast, and not his own podcast, but somebody else's podcast, saying that these were making it sound like these were just affairs, and they made an NDA deal to make it go away, and that was it. No, this was clearly, according to Janelle Grant, a long relationship with a series of sexual assaults and trauma.
It's, it makes me think of the Ray Rice case from a number of years ago, where this domestic violence incident was reported on, but it was once that video was put out and people could visually see it, it just became, there was no wiggle room if you were a defender of Ray Rice when you see this video. And I think in this case, it was, listen, if you want to, like, I thought it was pretty appalling what the initial allegations were. I mean, like, one of them, like, coercion into oral sex. I mean, these were like, I don't know. I guess just the depth of the details we got in this case, and to your point, a name and a face attached to it. It's it's made it that much harder that even the most ardent supporter of a Vince McMahon, I think, is, sitting this one out.
Yeah, I think it sort of speaks to how people consume news and media, is that people get the vague gist of it. And in 2022, that's what they got, that there were NDAs and there was hush money being paid. And the headlines in this case are different and are more graphic.
Yeah. And I want to go back to some of these comments. This was from a year ago on the Bill Simmons podcast when Nick Khan appeared. And this was right after Vince McMahon had made his return onto the board of directors using his controlling shares to be able to get back onto the board. And what we saw over this past year, Brandon, was not just Vince McMahon forced his way back and there was some, protest against Vince McMahon, but we subtly did see a semi-rehabilitation of his image. And that went to the freedom that a Nick Khan and Pat McAfee had just 2 days before this lawsuit drops. And they are speaking of this genius figure who's just this eclectic, operator of this company that is a genius. The WWE was marketing.
We all wouldn't be here if not for him.
The WWE is marketing a Royal Rumble t-shirt in honor of his Royal Rumble win in 1999. That was pulled after this lawsuit came out. The Netflix documentary series, all these things, it's not as though
Ari Emanuel sat next to him and said, "Oh my God, yes, I needed him to stay with the company."
The biggest example is Ari Emanuel, not just going along to bring Vince McMahon, but demanding, giving up equity in this merger in terms of having Vince McMahon's involvement. So this first clip is Bill Simmons asking Nick Khan about Vince McMahon's initial decision to step away in July of 2022 amidst the reporting in the Wall Street Journal of various NDAs.
So I think it was always my point of view, always Stephanie's point of view. At some point, he would come back. I think the way that he played it to me was smart, Bill, in that he went away for 5-6 months, which people, meaning the audience, seems to like when somebody does that. And he came back and took control back of his company as a control shareholder. So it is the public's company, as a publicly traded company, but with that controlling share, gave him a lot of authority, and he used it, and I applaud him for doing so.
So at that time, this was almost presented as this was a brilliant strategy on Vince McMahon's part. And I'm going to also preface, Nick Khan is in a position where this is the public message that he is going to have to put out there. Whether these are his true feelings, that can be regardless, but those are his public comments that his name is attached to. And I do feel you have to own your comments, past and present. And this is not as though this lawsuit came out last Thursday and suddenly we were aghast. All of this was these were allegations that had been reported on, and to look at it as though this was just a PR sabbatical, I think you're naturally going to have people even today that are going to question the legitimacy of a Vince McMahon truly divorced from TKO and WWE.
Ronda Rousey's questioning it.
Exactly. If Ronda Rousey brings that up, and I don't have any reason to believe Vince McMahon has any connection, but if you are on the outside looking in, you pretty much, if you're Nick Khan, had stated, listen, everyone knew he was going to come back. This was a smart PR strategy. Go away for a few months, and then you are brought back in. You have to look at that as your public message of a year ago. And now when this guy is beyond radioactive, I think you're not going to have as much faith in whatever this company comes out with, because you do have 12 months to just go and look at how they assess that period in 2022.
Yeah, I think we were critical of Nick Khan at the time when he did that interview, and how obsequious he was to Vince McMahon, and to say he could have said a lot of things, and he could have said that he has the right to do this, and that that's his right to come back. He has controlling share. He has 81% of the vote. That's his power and that's his right. But he didn't have to say that he played it smart and that I applaud him for coming back. And Nick Khan is one of the officers who I think we need to ask, what did you know and when did you know it? When did you become aware for the first time that there was at least an inappropriate relationship? It doesn't seem even Vince is denying that there was an inappropriate relationship between himself and Janelle Grant.
We have our guest coming up in a couple of minutes, but this is the last clip from the Bill Simmons show last year. This was being asked about Vince staging his return to the board of directors and his role after the board had unanimously voted for him not to return, and Vince getting a chuckle out of that and stating, well, that's nice that you're going to have a vote. I'm going to overrule your vote.
Were you surprised that he's started to inch his way back?
No. That's Vince.
Yeah.
Anyone who knows him who thought with a tweet, because I think he tweeted, hey, I'm 77 now, time for me to call it a day or something to that effect, when he stepped down. Anyone who believed that was permanent doesn't know him. That was never going to happen. But I'm appreciative of the fact that he gave it the 5-6 months, let the dust settle a little bit, and then coming back in the way that he's come back.
How much?
Okay, that was Bill Simmons. He was just caught mid-thought. He wanted to get back to us. But essentially, yes, that was Nick Khan, again, in January of 2023, when Vince McMahon had just come back to the company. And I think it's important to look at how this was handled and explained by the company as well, in terms of, it was not as though this board welcomed him back with open arms, but was in a position where, he forced his way back in, and now I think there is going to be a lot of fallout in terms of that, the handling, what was known, and questions about this independent investigation that I think will persist in terms of exactly what was known in that investigation, and how deep did they dig in, and what does Jeffrey Speed mean by outreach to Janelle Grant and her representation?
Yeah, and as far as people making public comments, especially in contrast to Paul Levesque, we saw the comment that the Bella twins, or I don't know if we should call them the Garcia twins, made, who are in a remarkably, not from a professional level, they're not executives at WWE, obviously, but they're, their father-in-law, John Laurinaitis, is involved in this, and they made a statement a few days ago, which is, we are shocked and disheartened with the recent allegations against members of the WWE. It has been a lot to process since we found out this past week, just as you all did. This is something we don't stand for or condone from anyone, no matter who they are. And I don't think it would be, stepping on anything if Paul Levesque made a very similar comment on Saturday, but he did not.
At this time, we're going to bring in our special guest who has been covering this story. He is a senior sports legal expert at Sportico. Joining us now is Michael McCann. And Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
You got it. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to start here that our audience, they have processed this lawsuit in the horrific details that has been outlined in. At this stage of things, what are the next steps that we're looking towards, specifically for the defenders in this case, and where things will be moving towards in terms of the next steps in the process?
Yeah, it will take some time to play out. So the next steps would be answering the complaint. McMahon and WWE will answer the complaint and deny the allegations. So that's the first step in responding to a complaint, is a denial. And then subsequent to that, they'll likely petition for a motion to dismiss. And the dismissal will probably raise several arguments, one of which I imagine is the arbitration clause that's in the NDA, which I think will end up being a pretty important feature of this. It's not going to attract as many headlines because of what was alleged in the complaint, but to the extent it's enforceable and it prevents the plaintiff from moving forward, it would mean that the lawsuit's dismissed to arbitration. Now, there's a federal law, the Speak Out Act, that President Biden signed into law in 2022 that restricts the use of NDAs and arbitration provisions when they concern sexual harassment or sexual assault. The NDA itself, though, doesn't reference sexual harassment. So there'll be arguments going back and forth on that, and this will take some time to play out.
And Michael, thanks for joining us. So I've been looking at the docket, and it looks like all three parties, the defendants, were served on January 26th. So then they now have 21 days to answer. Is that right? And that would put their deadline to answer, if it doesn't get extended, to February 16th.
Yeah, that math sounds right. And there are extensions, so it wouldn't be unusual if that deadline isn't met. There are a variety of reasons why that could happen, but that's most likely. And then beyond that, there would be a motion to dismiss filed sometime thereafter.
What would be the criteria for the judge to believe that arbitration is the right avenue to go down? Is it just going to be simply his interpretation of the language in the NDA, or are there extenuating factors that he'll take into consideration?
Yeah, and the use of arbitration, I mean, this is really an employment law dispute at its heart. I mean, it sort of is couched as something bigger than that, but it's really an employment law dispute. And like Brian Flores going against the NFL, there's sort of a symmetry there in looking at the role of arbitration that has limited his lawsuit. Here, the judge will look at whether or not this agreement, the NDA, is enforceable. And the key question there is going to be, when looking at the federal law, the Speak Act, which prohibits the use of NDAs when they concern sexual harassment, did this agreement concern sexual harassment? Now, Anne probably will say, no, this was a general termination agreement. She was leaving the company, and there's no reference to sexual harassment. There's no admission of any sort of guilt in it. There's no even loose to any sort of harassment. Now, the counter argument that Grant will probably argue is, of course, this is about sexual harassment. You paid me $75,000 to $200,000 a year. Why are you now agreeing to a termination where I get $3 million? Right? That's an enormous amount of money. People leave a company if they're making $100,000. I don't know of anyone else that gets paid $3 million. Right? So obviously that money was for something, and the judge has to walk through that.
And thinking about, there's three different parties here. There's Vince McMahon, who's now resigned from all positions at TKO and WWE. There's John Laurinaitis, who was terminated in 2022 from WWE, and then there's WWE itself. I'm curious your thoughts on whether how likely it is that all the defendants' interests are going to be aligned, and are they actually going to be represented by the same set of attorneys?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think their interests are largely aligned, at least at this point. And I say that because the sort of pool of evidence involves all of them. And the pool of evidence would include emails, texts, witness statements. They have an incentive to collaborate on this. And the fact that it's a civil matter and not a criminal matter is also important. That if this were a criminal matter, sometimes there's the prisoner's dilemma, right? Where you want to cut a deal with prosecutors first before the other people in a conspiracy do that. This is different. This is a civil matter. And it's not to downgrade it, but the stakes are really about money, not about any sort of criminal sanction. So I think at this point, my guess is that their interests are aligned. Now, that could change as time goes on. Whether they use their own attorneys, given their wealth, there's probably a good chance they do use separate attorneys. It's usually advisable. When I've been involved with litigations, I think it's usually a good idea to have separate attorneys when you have multiple defendants. And although their interests overlap, there is a chance there could be some disagreement. For instance, specifically with McMahon, did WWE meet its duties to shareholders in how they handled him? I mean, that's a question that WWE, its response, could reveal, yeah, we did this to him, we did that to him. That could put McMahon in a bad light. So their interests aren't entirely aligned, but I think they're largely aligned, at least at this point.
And just thinking about the fact that we know that there was as far as I know, still ongoing, a federal grand jury investigation into something related to Vince McMahon, according to WWE's own filings last year. Does the fact that this lawsuit is out tell us anything about the future of that investigation in terms of, does it rule out that he won't be indicted?
No, I don't think it tells us anything in terms of likelihood of an indictment. I think the longer time goes, if there's no action on an indictment, if the grand jury doesn't act usually within 18 months, it's probably not going to happen. And I don't know when that grand jury process began. I don't know where they're at. Grand juries.
The subpoena was served on him July 17th, 2023 is when the search warrant was executed on him.
So it probably started then before that, right? Because they would have already formed the grand jury. So let's assume it's, I don't know, a year in, something like that. So it's still within the realm that there could be an indictment. But grand juries are conducted in secret. They are notorious. I remember, my criminal law professor would say they're totally unfair because they're run by the prosecutor. And if prosecutor really wants someone indicted, they're presenting the evidence. The role of the defense is fairly limited. So we'll see. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen on that. I don't think this lawsuit is a precursor to an indictment, nor does it rule out indictment.
Yeah, and just to add some detail, the Wall Street Journal did report when Vince resigned in July 2022, they reported at the time that was, what encouraged him to resign was that there were SEC and U.S. attorney investigations happening at that time. So I suppose it could be, coming up on a year and a half or something like that. I don't know if that's the same investigation though.
Yeah, the tricky part there is the investigation would usually precede the grand jury, so it's hard to know.
Okay.
Based on the gap between those things.
Michael, just in terms of the reaction from Vince McMahon himself, he has put out a statement denying these allegations, but at the same time also stepping down as its executive chairman. From his perspective, does that resignation, is that going to be viewed in terms of, you are both maintaining your innocence, but at the same time stepping down because of the undue backlash that this has caused? Like, what do you think went into kind of the legal positioning by opting to resign while also denying these claims?
Yeah, John, I think you summarized it well, that he really has two objectives. One is to continue to deny the allegations, right? That's the most important step for him, is to say the claims of unlawful acts did not occur. He's going to have to explain these texts that allegedly occurred. Now, again, we haven't seen them, so we got to give the defense a chance to respond. But one goal, of course, is to deny that there was any unlawful acts. And then secondarily, it's a distraction for the company, right? To have the face of your entity accused of some really awful things. So at the same time, the company probably doesn't want him connected to it, that it's a bad look for the company. It's a publicly traded company. So him resigning likely accomplishes the goal of trying to create some distance, although I think it's going to be hard to create distance given his fame, that everyone sort of associates him with WWE and long have. So I don't know if reputationally it's going to have a big effect, but legally it makes sense for him to continue to deny and separate himself. Now, when you separate yourself, sometimes there's risk, right? Because you're no longer connected to a group that's part of the litigation. And to the extent, going back to the earlier question about are their interests aligned, maybe that creates a little bit of friction because he's not part of the same group. I don't know if that's going to happen. He clearly still has a lot of ties, so maybe that's not much of an issue. It's hard to know looking from the outside in.
Right. How about from just the shareholders' perspective? Will they need, if there is a concern from shareholders about the decision by Endeavor to include Vince McMahon with this merger? Are we looking at things like the stock has largely been unchanged amidst all of this chaos of the past week, and we had a sponsor in Slim Jim that was temporarily out and then back in after Vince McMahon's resignation. So do you look at this as like the shareholder perspective of this? You are going to need to see some tangible damages from this versus the company, in their mind, doing whatever they have been able to do by removing Vince McMahon from this equation.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. We have not seen the stock price lower. I get it's hovering around whatever it is, 86 or something like that. But it's been like that for a while. It doesn't appear as if last week had some major change in the price that you would sometimes expect if there's a big scandal with the company. And that speaks to the strength of the company, and that they have a certain sense of brand power that goes beyond McMahon, that if you think about it, the worst media attention for this lawsuit is likely at the beginning. Now, maybe one day there'll be more, there'll be other pieces of evidence that surface, but the worst news cycle is at the start, and that they were able to withstand that, it seems, is certainly something they're probably encouraged by. In terms of, will that change? I guess it remains to be seen. The shareholders, I think, have a right to ask, why was he able to come back? Were enough steps taken to remove him? Those are fair questions. Now, there may be an explanation that he controlled the entity, and that at the end of the day, it's hard to kind of get around that fact. So that presents a challenge as well.
And thinking about the fact that this lawsuit filed by Janelle Grant is a civil lawsuit. Something that listeners have been asking us about is whether there will be criminal charges filed, and my impression is that might become, if he does get indicted, that might be part of an indictment. And let me know if I'm right about this, that the burden of proof for a civil case is lower, so it's easier to make a case as a civil lawsuit than it would be as in criminal court.
That's exactly right. That's right, Brendan. So we have no idea if this is going to become a criminal matter. The filing of a civil lawsuit is by no means a precursor to a criminal act. Sometimes it can be. We've seen that with some recent issues in terms of sort of those in Hollywood. But in general, this does not mean that there will be charges. If there's a grand jury and there's an indictment, that could change. But it is easier to win a civil lawsuit. In a criminal case, ultimately, a jury has to be persuaded beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a super high threshold, and prosecutors normally are reticent to bring cases if they feel like the chance of getting that kind of verdict is unsure. So here, without having seen the evidence, the risk to this case, though, to McMahon is that if this does lead to evidence that suggests things were really bad, that could potentially be detrimental to him in terms of the possibility of a criminal charge. But we're not anywhere near that yet. It will take a denial of a motion to dismiss before pretrial discovery occurs, and pretrial discovery would be the sharing of evidence, the sharing of emails, texts, witness statements, getting WWE people under oath, getting McMahon under oath. These are things that would happen later on, months from now, probably.
My last question, Michael, as it relates to other women that have signed NDAs, and part of this case was the hope that others will come forward. For those individuals that have NDAs, let's, for the sake of argument, assume it's similar language as Janelle Grant's, but they have been paid in full. Would they be putting themselves at great risk if they were to come forward now, where there is not an interrupting of the payments? They have been paid in full. What kind of are they in a position where they could come forward right now from a legal standpoint?
They could. The Speak Out Act really goes to this issue of NDAs that are designed to basically hide sexual harassment or worse. I don't know whether they will. I think that's going to be an interesting part of this, is what happens if there are others that come. And without knowing the details of those NDAs and the circumstances, it's hard to know. But I guess we'll see on that. It's an interesting question.
Well, Michael, it's a very, very big subject. I hope that we can pick this conversation up down the road. We really appreciate you jumping on and informing us of kind of the legal picture here, as you explained to all of our viewers as well as the two of us.
You got it. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks, Michael. You can read Michael McCann at McCann Sports Law on X and over at Sportico.com as well. So I think it's very interesting on the side of the criminal charges. And I think that is going to be the ultimate question that so many are going to be coming back to and asking about in terms of the civil case. And is this the extent that these accusations are going to go, where, as Michael explained, like the civil case, like it is essentially, this is about money, but these outlines, these allegations are these are crimes that are being alleged, and whether it is a grand jury investigation or other entities that are looking at this, I mean, there is a huge spotlight on this story, and the further this case goes, I think it's going to be that much more damaging for the defendants involved.
Yeah, I mean, if you read the complaint, these are a number of allegedly very serious crimes, and we know that there are other women who have NDAs with him for various allegations of sexual misconduct. So it's according to multiple purported victims, it's not limited to just one person.
Okay. We have a couple of super chats that we're going to get to in relation. We'll answer these as best we can. From a Glassdoor Gamer, thank you for the super chat. Bruce Rivers thinks this goes to jury and WWE will be prosecuting. It won't be settled, and punitive damages could be in the hundreds of millions. I'm not familiar with Bruce Rivers, but in terms of that's that's a theory. I mean, it's one that I mean, it really depends. It is on the side of the plaintiffs. I mean, this is, I think people have to keep in mind the idea of how much psychologically going through a case like this is for the plaintiff involved, and the idea of potentially like years of litigation before and an appeal, and how much you are going to be front and center attached to this with your name, your face, these allegations. And you can absolutely understand why many victims opt to remain anonymous and just hope that this all disappears and goes away. So
People are letting us know that Bruce Rivers is a famous YouTube lawyer.
Okay, well there you have it, Bruce Rivers. So I mean that's his thought. Let us go to Pete in Texas. With the new NDA laws being signed by the Biden administration in 2022, can NDAs prior to 2022 be deemed invalid due to sexual assault? That's my understanding, is that there is a period now that you can go back to, and that they cannot be enforced. It is not as though it's just from this period onward. I mean, this NDA in question that we're talking about would have been signed in January of 2022, right?
Yeah,
before the allegations first came out. But that's that. Christopher writes in, what attempts will be made to uncover Vince's enablers within WWE, i.e. the people with knowledge of these hideous acts, or will they try to bury this? Well, as Michael explained, I mean, if this gets to the point of depositions, I mean, there will be subpoenas, there will be, I mean, there could be a very, like, especially if we're talking about the potential of a grand jury investigation, there will be no stone left unturned if we're talking about that level of investigation into all of this. Now, on a civil case, I mean, this is going to be, those involved that might be deposed.
You would think that the incentive on the defendant's side to settle this, so it doesn't get to that, would be very high. But it all depends on, if they try to settle it, how much is Janelle Grant willing to settle for, or does she want to see this through?
Next up is Louis. What is the role of wrestling media in covering this issue versus mainstream media, and how does such a niche media space deal with such a sensitive issue? I mean, it's ultimately, I think that it is, just varying degrees of how you expect coverage. I mean, the fact is, we can, I think, dedicate a lot more time and resources. Well, I won't say resources, but at least time
Resources
to the story. But I mean, it's ultimately, listen, this is happening because there are major outlets out there that have the ability to engage in reporting of this level, that have the backing of this from a legal standpoint. I mean, there's a reason that this takes that weight when you have a Wall Street Journal, like an enterprise journalistic outlet like the Wall Street Journal, that can properly report out a story of this magnitude.
Yeah, I think, I think we have similar responsibilities. I guess the big question, and I think I remember saying this about a year and a half ago, we probably wrote an article about it, about how it's really up to the mainstream media to see how seriously they take this. Do they pursue it, or is it the same old, the sports media doesn't want to follow this because it's fake wrestling, and the entertainment media doesn't want to follow it because it's lowbrow entertainment, and the more general mainstream media doesn't want to cover it because it's, it's silly wrestling. I would say, you tell me what you've seen, John. I've seen less silly B-roll of Vince McMahon during this story, right? Because now we have really detailed descriptions of really terrible, sexual assaults.
No puns, like, which sounds silly, but you were still seeing those, like, in 2022. Like, it was still like hey, this is still the circus. Let's all remember that. I've seen way less of that this time around. And I mean, it's like Vince McMahon has, like, you run B-roll of Vince McMahon. Like, it's typically, it's him getting his head shaved with Donald Trump and such. I mean, this is someone that, like, this is a very serious story. And I've definitely seen, like, that degree of more of a serious tone attached to this. Not to say that in 2022 it was a joke, but you could still see some places covering this, and it was still the sideshow wrestling spectacle that somehow skirts by real world criticism.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of conversation around, whether people are doing reporting or whether they're content creators, and I think that's all well and good until we get to a very serious story like this, where the people who have the platforms that disseminate the information, including us, have more of a responsibility in cases like this to cover stories with the seriousness that they demand. And I think if there are outlets that are not, not covering the story, but have a wrestling beat and they're not doing that much to cover it, I think they're doing a disservice to the industry that, may have a very serious, deep institutional problem and a work culture that supports things like what are alleged in this lawsuit.
Yeah. And I mean, there is also the fact of connecting the dots between this right now, which, I mean, you read this case, like it is painting a picture of a cultural issue at WWE. And for those that do the legwork and link this back to the child sex scandal of the early 90s, I mean, there's a lot of history to all of this, and putting
And
all of these.
Lee Cole had a video that he posted of him, giving a long, I think it was like 17, 20-minute statement.
Yeah, this is the older brother of Tom Cole, who was at the forefront of the sex scandal of the early 90s and took his life several years ago. It's a tragic story. And I've mentioned this before, but our friends Chris Zellner and David Bixenspan have put out their Titan Gate series. It's a 4-part series that they have put up for free at patreon.com/between the sheets. It's an invaluable resource to learn that story, both from sort of a chronological standpoint as it was happening beginning in 1992, the reporting, the mainstream coverage of it, and why it was, how this went from a case about underage ring boys being assaulted and turning into the steroid distribution charges that kind of this gets remembered as from the early 90s. But they put these shows up for free on their Patreon. I would highly recommend everyone listen to this, because understanding the history and being through a case like this that they came out of and soared in the late 90s. And here we are. And this is again being, all these years later, 30 years later, and looking underneath and seeing what is the culture of this company. Is this limited to one or two individuals, or is this something that this was again, you don't want to assign blame to others there, but what was being fostered and what was being, whether it was just people deciding to be quiet about things, not feeling that they were even in a position to call out discretions that maybe they were privy to as well. These are all things that need to be asked and investigated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said, that I think those came out maybe around a year ago from David Bixenspan and Chris Zellner, and nobody's poured through the research of many things, including that story like they have.
All right, we are going to wrap things up. Before we get on out of here, wouldn't be a full Pollock and Thurston without a few ratings notes. We go back to Saturday, Brandon, and there were 300,000 viewers, an average, that did tune in to Collision, that chose Collision over the Royal Rumble, 0.06 in the 18 to 49 demographic. And as I go through the Wrestlenomics viewership spreadsheet, women 18 to 34 decided, you know what? We're going to be the one uptick in audience this week. They went from 15,000 to 19,000, the one area that was not a gigantic loss from the prior week.
But still down compared to the last 4 weeks. Everything was down here.
Still down. I mean, this was the lowest Saturday night audience for an episode of Collision. There was one Friday night episode back in November that was lower, but nothing ever, even including that Friday night show in the 18 to 49 demo, lower. I mean, we knew this was going to be a bludgeoning on Saturday night. It was, and this will probably be a similar picture come April for night one of WrestleMania.
Yeah. One of the
Eugene
first
Nagata
ones,
couldn't hold this one up.
That's a shame. I'm disappointed in people not tuning in to see Eugene Nagata. But the first one was SummerSlam the first PLE that they went against. I know.
Yes.
Money in the Bank was earlier in the day. Yeah, SummerSlam was
head to head, but
head to head. Yeah, and we've seen just like in Money in the Bank, which aired earlier in the day, not at 8 p.m. Eastern. That seemed to have an effect too, based on the Saudi Arabia event that was also earlier in the day, having an effect on Collision. Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to what this rating is going to look like in April when it goes head to head with night one of WrestleMania. Yeah, I mean, there's not that many other nights that aren't occupied with primetime wrestling. In fact, I think only Sunday night is the one that's available. So, and I'm not sure if that's that much better. So, I expect it to probably have that new low record get broken on night one of WrestleMania.
At least before WrestleMania for Collision, they are somewhat in the clear. This weekend, NXT has a Sunday night premium live event, so they won't be going head to head with that. The Australia show is same day, but as we mentioned, is at 5 a.m. in the morning.
I'm very curious to see how that works out. See if it does have an effect, because we've seen in 2 instances where, again, earlier in the day, it still had an effect.
Yeah, you could have your fans that just it's Elimination Chamber, Okada's farewell, and then you cap off the day with Collision. Like, what more could you ask for on a given day? Raw on Monday night, which had the first hour commercial free, doing 1,909,000 viewers, the most watched Raw since June, and doing a 0.61 in the demo. I mean, first hour was over 2 million viewers. That opened up with CM Punk announcing that he's not going to be going to WrestleMania, but the peak segment reserved for Cody Rhodes and Seth Rollins, as you can see on Brandon's quarter-hour breakdown.
Yeah, so this was, like you said, a commercial-free hour one, although we do have an ad break marked here for the very last quarter hour of hour one. So I think they might have squeezed one in for hour one at the very end. But yeah, I mean, the Cody Rhodes and Seth Rollins segment did really well. It grew the audience by 10%. It was the peak in total viewership and in the demo. Also benefited from no commercial breaks. Yeah, the third hour went down more than usual, but I don't know. You could say that wasn't just because the first hour did an average that was so much better than usual because of the lack of ads. In terms of this being a post pay-per-view Raw, this did about usual in terms of the bump that it does. So I have a table where I show, how much of a bump was this versus the trailing 4 weeks, and this was pretty much what you would expect for a post Royal Rumble show. If I can put this on the screen fast enough, there it is. So this did versus the last 4 weeks. So we're looking at the demo here, which is a little more volatile and maybe a little bit more, hard to hang on to. This was up 39% in the demo versus the trailing 4 weeks, which is actually a lot better than it was last year. So you could say, I guess, that maybe this was even better than usual. And I don't know if you're going to talk about SmackDown, but SmackDown was up as well.
I wanted to ask you
the news.
That's what I wanted to ask you in terms of, yes, it was the night before the Royal Rumble, but this was the first show after everything broke with Vince McMahon, and his resignation occurred during the body of SmackDown on top of it.
Right.
I guess I just ask, like I understand the nature to maybe that prompts you to tune into SmackDown, but I cannot.
Happened in the summer of 2022 also. Remember, SmackDown was way up. He appeared on it, of course, and was advertised to appear on it. And then Raw the following Monday, he made a surprise appearance for, but it was up regardless. And then even NXT had a better rating
all
than
received
usual.
Bumps afterwards. And I mean, I looked at that somewhat as the first one being Vince did promote himself being on the show. Like for this one, I'm just like, Vince ain't showing up, and there ain't a prayer they're addressing this on the show either. But I guess there's still that curiosity factor on top of it. But
yeah, I remember saying at the time, it just puts WWE more at top of mind for people, and that leads to more people than usual tuning in. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was their largest audience since last September. I think the
biggest
Rock
total
and Pat
since
McAfee show.
Are we talking about SmackDown here?
Yeah, I think it was September. So anyway, it was largest show in months for SmackDown going into the Royal Rumble.
Yeah,
and
highest P2, highest total since September 15th, highest demo since August 25th.
And lost in everything. We never got the Royal Rumble press release. We didn't get like a viewership percentage. We didn't nothing coming out of this Royal Rumble, did we?
No, nothing. They should have put out a positive press release to try to offset some of the negative press that they're getting.
Well, maybe the idea of putting a press release out and touting our amazing week was maybe not the right call to make on Monday. Yeah,
maybe that's the right choice. Yeah.
All right. Last thing, let's just note on Kazuchika Okada. So there was a lot of concern because Pro Wrestling Tees announced Okada's merch is coming down. It has been noted the fact that this is more so an indication of New Japan merchandise that they cannot continue to offer for Okada should not be taken as a signal of where the individual is going. Although Fightful just had a report go up about, companies being in talks with him, and his deal is actually up now. If you figure in the time change in Japan, because January 31st was the last day on his contract. He has 3 matches that he will continue to perform in February for New Japan. But after that February 24th date, that will be it in New Japan, and he's going to land somewhere. Is Game Changer going to just come in at the last second? Nick Gage, Rainmaker.
Could be Game Changer Wrestling. It could be NWA. You can't rule out MLW. The list goes on.
NWA. I mean, there's all these options out there. The
Super
CW
Kicks
app
in Toronto. I mean, who knows?
All possibilities for one Kazuchika Okada. All right. Well, we want to thank Michael McCann for joining us, as do we want to thank you, the listener, the viewer out there, for stopping by tonight. Wei Ting and I are back with Rewinded Dynamite. We'll be here on the Post Wrestling YouTube channel at 10:05 p.m. Eastern time for the show in New Orleans. That is taking place tonight. Brandon, you had a great show on Sunday, kind of going through your own experiences at the Royal Rumble press conference and continuing to go through the Vince McMahon case. And for those that want to, check out Brandon this coming Sunday. Are we back to the regular Sunday morning? Can I sit back with my coffee and listen to Wrestlenomics?
And you know what? Actually, it's free for everyone this coming Sunday. It'll be free on YouTube and all the platforms for everybody just to sample. And if you like it, you can subscribe. You can actually sign up for a trial even, but you eventually get charged $5 a month. And you get access to that Sunday show every week, as well as all my TV ratings reports, the viewership spreadsheet that we were just looking at a moment ago, and anything else I post on Patreon.
Yeah, I don't want to make this too self-deferential, but when we get the question about sort of like niche wrestling outlets out there, I mean, quite honestly, it is because of people supporting like sites like Wrestlenomics that allow Brandon to go to a show like the Royal Rumble, to have a seat and to get those questions in. So, I mean, you have a lot of power just to support these like niche wrestling outlets that if you enjoy the work, not to say like, listen, I am appreciative of anyone who tunes in free or otherwise, but like this is not outlets that we have these giant companies behind us that are funding these sites. Like these are ones.
It's not my personal money that I use. It's your money.
Yes.
Seriously.
So patreon.com/Wrestlenomics, patreon.com/postwrestling. If you enjoy our coverage, that is where you can support the various outlets, this co-branding of Pollock and Thurston. But that's going to wrap things up. Again, thank you to Michael McCann. We're back next Wednesday, unless something breaks. And then you know what? The bat signal goes up and Brandon and I jump on. One show this week tentatively, but you never know.
See.
You have 3 last week to catch up on. But that's it for us. Thank you for tuning in to Pollock and Thurston.